I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for our first set of panelists. When a consortium of the leading Barnett Shale production companies founded the Barnett Shale Energy Education Council in 2007, it selected Ed Ireland as their executive director. Dr. Ireland and the BSEEC are dedicated to promoting education and best practices as they relate to oil, gas, leasing, drilling, production, transportation, and marketing in the Barnett Shale. Dr. Ireland's executive management experience, operational expertise, and 20-year oil and gas career made him the ideal candidate to oversee the activities of the BSEEC and implement educational and outreach programs in the 24-county area that makes up the Barnett Shale. As an industry expert, he also acts as spokesperson for the Barnett Shale as well as community and media representative on behalf of the BSEEC members. He serves on the board of directors of the TCU Energy Institute and was a co-founder of the Metropex Natural Gas Vehicle Consortium. I'd like to introduce Mr. Ed Ireland.
Very much, Barbara. Good morning. Looks like a good group here, and glad to be able to kick it off this morning with the first session, which is entitled Tap It Lightly, Policy and Regulations. And, that would suggest to me that our topic here is regulation and overregulation, regulation versus overregulation. And I would define regulation to be, or overregulation, to be any regulations for which the costs outweigh the benefits. All regulations have costs. Some regulations have benefits. But if the costs outweigh the benefits, at least I would call that overregulation. And we know it's a timely topic. I'm sure you can all think of situations very currently that you would probably define as overregulation. One that comes to mind is the EPA establishing new ozone standards that are so onerous that most areas of the country will not be able to achieve those standards. You have other things going on nationally and locally in terms of drilling and hydraulic fracturing that some municipalities are, it's already happened in Colorado and some other municipalities and states, actually, that have banned hydraulic fracturing specifically. And New York State, for example, currently has a moratorium, as they say, on fracking, but in reality, it's a ban. They keep putting it off or leaving it in place. And that's happening. In Colorado, one city has banned fracking. So there's certainly a lot of situations, I think you would agree, that is overregulation, and of course we're going to focus in on Texas. But I would say there are at least 3 reasons why overregulation occurs. And one is that regulators can tend to get tied up with themselves or just think that their job is to regulate and there's no end to it. And so they just continue to regulate, perhaps beyond their authority. Another reason is that some of the environmentalist organizations really push for overregulation. Again, there's no end to how much regulation that they would push for. And another reason is, I think that a lot of citizens, voters, have a very poor level of energy education and will actually push for or accept overregulation just because they don't understand the industry or what the regulations are really supposed to do. Now, you look at the oil and gas industry and say, well, I mean, that's certainly no stranger to regulation. It's one of the most regulated industries in the country. And yet, again, back to just energy education, I'm frequently asked, how is it that the natural gas industry operates without regulations? I hear that all the time. And they say, well, I've read that the oil and gas industry is exempt from federal air and water standards. And you say, well, how is it that you have these notions? And it's just all part of the lack of energy education. I speak to a lot of groups. In fact, I was on campus here at SMU just last week speaking to a student organization. And I'm always interested to observe how little really otherwise intelligent people seem to know about energy. And they just don't make the connection between, let's say, oil and gas and their lives. When I ask people who in here uses natural gas, frequently I'll have no one raise their hand. They don't, and I'll say, well, what about your cell phone? What's it made out of? Plastic. Where does plastic come from? How do you charge it? Where does electricity come from? There's a disconnect. And I think a lot of times people will think, well, let's just impose more regulations because it doesn't affect me. And so I think we find ourselves in that situation where it's very easy to overregulate. And finally, I just point out the lack of interest, I guess, that a lot of people have in energy. There was a University of Texas poll recently that found, they've been conducting this poll every year for a number of years, and they found that people's interest in energy is declining over time. They read less about it. They're just not interested. And when you have that situation, it's rife for overregulation to occur because people just don't understand what's going on. So, well, enough of my soapbox about energy education, but and tied to regulation and overregulation. But I want to get to the panel. What I'm going to do is just introduce the panelists one at a time and ask an initial question. And then after we go through that, we'll engage in some conversation. So the first panelist here on my left is David Porter, Commissioner of the Railroad Commission of Texas. Commissioner Porter was elected to serve a 6-year term in 2010, November 2010. And since taking office, he's been appointed to the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission as the official representative of Texas by Governor Perry. He's also appointed as Governor Perry's official representative on the Interstate Mining Compact Commission, and currently serves on the advisory board as a member of the Texas Journal of Oil, Gas, and Energy Law. Before taking office, Porter built a successful small business around his CPA practice in Midland, Texas, providing accounting and tax services to oil and gas producers, royalty owners, oil field service companies, and other small businesses and individuals. So let me ask the first question. David, one of the issues you have focused on is, I guess you'd say, fighting the federal government, especially the EPA, and their attempts to come into the state of Texas and probably overregulate. What are your thoughts on the EPA and other agencies versus the state regulatory authority?
I think as we look at this issue, probably both from a philosophical and a practical viewpoint, if you're concerned about overregulation, I think there's a great tendency for the federal government to overregulate, and there are several reasons for that. One of the big things to think about is one size regulations doesn't fit everything, and I think that's one of the biggest problems when you have federal government regulating. They tend to look at large, huge regulations to cover every facet in every part of the country. Even in the state of Texas, the geographic and geological diversity between the Panhandle, the Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford, the Gulf Coast, East Texas is tremendous. And you spread that through the entire nation. If you talk about what's going on in California versus Alaska versus the Marcellus or the Utica, the Northeast versus the Gulf Coast, You know, it's just impossible really to write good, effective regulations to fit all those different sources and circumstances. And that's why I think it's not only historically, but it makes sense from a geological viewpoint to regulate closer to the level, which is at state level, which is historically what has been done in this nation, and it's worked well. And I think it's imperative on me and fellow railroad commissioners to make the case that if we're going to sit here and argue that we don't need federal regulation, then you talk about the proper level of regulation. And I think we do that very well here in the state of Texas, and let you know a little bit about, so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about the Railroad Commission and how we regulate here in the state. As you know, we were formed in 1891. The name of the Railroad Commission kind of indicates that oil and gas regulation was not our primary mission when started, but over the years that has changed, and we're now the primary oil and gas regulatory agency in the state. We also deal quite a bit with a number of pipeline issues, different types of pipelines, regulate the local distribution companies on natural gas, also coal mining, coal and uranium surface mining exploration, the propane industry, and also service research and education to promote the use of propane and natural gas as an alternative fuel here in the state of Texas. But personally, I look at our mission as both protecting the health and safety of the people of Texas and making sure that Texas can economically and efficiently produce the energy that is needed to power our economy and literally the state itself. When we talk about the level of regulation, I think it's important to note how, and I'm sure, I'm not going to go into this great detail talking to this group, I'm sure everyone here realizes and understands how important energy, oil and gas energy, is to the economy of the United States. We talk about great economies in Texas, North Dakota, even parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania now made a great comeback because of oil and gas production. We're not talking about the great economy in New York and California, which are places that do have the potential for a lot of shale, but are not allowing the oil and gas industry to operate in an efficient, effective manner in those states, if at all. And that's why I think that regulation at the state level is important, that we maintain the operations that we have going on in places like Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. But having said that, I'm probably going to bore you a little bit with some statistics to read, which I usually don't do, but in this crowd, I think they'll be interested in knowing that in fiscal year 2013, the Oil and Gas Division staff conducted over 125,000 field inspections. Our Gas Services Division, which regulates 32 natural gas distribution utilities and 182 transmission and gathering utilities, conducted 141 utility field audits. The LP Gas Operations Program in the Alternative Energy Division conducted more than 13,000 LPG, LNG, and CNG safety inspections. Our Surface Mining Division conducted 505 inspections on 30 permitted lignite, which are coal mines, and 59 inspections on 14 uranium exploration sites. We issued 21,471 drilling permits, processed more than 3,400 stationary installation completion reports and approvals. Completed, and this is important to know, I think, completed 280 cleanup activities through site remediation, plugged 778 orphan wells, including 30 orphan bay wells in state coastal waters, as well as our new online application for the approval of oil and gas well status reports, Forms G10, W10, a number of IT updates which we're working on. But the reason I kind of bored you with those statistics is to let you know that we are increasing inspections and activity in the state. Well, the EPA in their recent budget is actually talking about cutting back on their activity, which I think does not, and to add a whole new major area to theirs does not make sense, even from a pragmatic viewpoint. So these are just some of the reasons why I think we need to continue to regulate the oil and gas industry at the state level. It's been done historically. I think it's more easier for the will of the people to be accessed on items when it's done at the state level. And it works, and we need to continue to make the case. Unfortunately, the perception's out there that it needs to be done at the federal level, and that is not really reality.
Okay, thank you, David. Our next panelist is Jeff REES, on David's left, who is Vice President of the Domestic Legal at Pioneer Natural Resources. Mr. REES, for approximately the last 8 years, has been in that position. He is responsible for managing the company's legal support for its Permian Basin activities, as well as handling the company's litigation matters, safety matters, and regulatory support, including working with the Railroad Commission. Over the years, REES has spoken on numerous oil and gas legal topics throughout Texas, and most recently led an oil and gas industry group on integrating horizontal legal needs with the historical application of vertical drilling rules. Prior to joining Pioneer, he worked with ConocoPhillips, where he was Assistant Corporate Secretary and Senior Counsel. His responsibilities at ConocoPhillips included international oil and gas matters, SEC compliance issues, and litigation. Prior to ConocoPhillips, REES was in private practice in the DFW area. So Jeff, let me ask you a question. Why do you think Texas is an ideal place for oil and gas development, given that there are parts of the country that perhaps have even larger shale deposits or perhaps larger reserves, but yet Texas is a good place to invest? Why do you think that?
Sure, I think there's kind of three things for that. The first two are, I think that the typical Texan will agree that Texas and the country needs oil and natural gas production. And secondly, to the extent that Texans and Texas can be involved in that production, that's a good thing for the state. I think that's unique from a lot of states on the first 2 points. I think that the history of Texas and its self-reliance and belief in Texas exceptionalism is very prevalent and a basis for the support of the entrepreneurial spirit of the oil and gas industry. I think Texans appreciate that the economics associated with the oil and gas industry are immense, and they further that independent streak that Texans have. In terms of a couple also of stats, Texans appreciate that over 10 million jobs in the good, well-paying jobs in America are supported by the oil and gas industry, and in Texas alone, almost 3 million jobs are in the state now because of the oil and gas industry. And people appreciate, and Texans appreciate the value of that. I think Texans also appreciate that the geopolitical implications of a strong oil and gas sector in the state as well as in the country. We're in the midst, in my opinion, of a revolution, of a rebirth of the oil and gas industry in the country. And we are in the midst of turning around perhaps America's greatest economic vulnerability over the last several decades, which is our reliance on foreign oil and gas. Has been lessened to a great extent over the last several years of our oil and gas natural production, which is being led by Texans in Texas. I think there's great long-term positives to the state and Texas from a geopolitical standpoint. The third reason I'd say that Texas is unique is, and you can look at this when you compare, as David mentioned, California or New York or other places that have strong reserves. they're not being developed is I think Texans believe in responsible production of oil and gas natural resources. And responsible means smart regulations and smart policy. And fortunately, we live in a state, again, I think from Texas exceptionalism, that they believe on Texans believe on looking at facts and not perhaps the fringe of the environmental movement's beliefs on viewpoints. And so, as a result, we have in Texas with our elected representatives and with the Railroad Commission, we have a heritage and a legacy of smart policy and smart regulations. The Railroad Commission is certainly regulates the oil and gas industry, but again in a smart way. They're not looking to stop production. They're looking for the oil and gas producers to do it responsibly. And so I think that smart policy and smart regulation is the third and perhaps the greatest reason why I think Texas is different than other states.
Okay, great, thank you. Our last panelist is William KEFFER, Bill KEFFER. Bill has been in-house counsel for ARCO Oil and Gas Company, a partner with the Dallas-based law firm of Gardner, Wynn and Sewell, and has been in his own practice for 13 years. His area of practice is focused primarily on handling complex environmental cases affecting the oil and gas industry. He also served 2 terms in the Texas legislature from 2003 to 2006 and has done some lobbying in Austin. He's on the board of SMU's McGuire Energy Institute, was appointed to the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission by Governor Perry, and is an arbitrator in the American Arbitrator Association. So Bill, let me ask you this question. Why should we in Texas be paying attention to when it comes to developing constructive policies and governing our oil and gas industry? Why should we be paying attention to that?
Well, this might sound a little simplistic, but I think probably for purposes of having, a discussion that would be fruitful for what we're talking about during this panel, rather than diving immediately into specific policies, it might be helpful to back up and think in terms of government policy 101. When I think about government policy and how it's typically made, presumably it starts with a core group of knowledgeable people, the experts who spend, day in and day out knowing about their subject matter, and as a result are best positioned to recommend what would be the best policy in whatever area, but of course we're talking about oil and gas today. And the fact is, unavoidably, there's always going to be a knowledge gap between that core group of experts and everybody else. And certainly the general population will never have access to that level of knowledge, that degree of knowledge, but that's also true with respect to our elected representatives. There's always going to be a knowledge gap between the people who are the experts on the subject and even our elected representatives for the most part. So what you're confronted with then is sort of what I consider to be the 2 driving forces in government policy in terms of how it plays out. Knowledge on the one hand, and then perception, which will necessarily fill the rest of the vacuum that isn't filled by knowledge. And so when perception on a particular topic is either dormant or relatively friendly, the experts, the people with the knowledge who have developed the policy, don't really have, many bumps in the road. Things proceed in the appropriate direction, and objectives are typically achieved because there isn't the resistance coming from the perception part of the equation. And yet, as we all know in the oil and gas industry, when perception is something other than that, when it's hostile, when it's active, when it's adversarial, that's when the resistance starts. That's when you feel like you're somewhat being surrounded by a much more active element. And the what I consider or refer to as the knowledge bench becomes much more important. You don't need to have a deep knowledge bench, using a sports metaphor, when things are moving along okay and there aren't problems. But when you start to have that resistance, when you start to have the attacks and the challenges on the perception side, that's when the knowledge bench depth becomes vitally important. And when perception overwhelms knowledge, that's when you feel like you become paralyzed and things happen like are happening in New York and other places. The reason I think we need to be focused and be concerned and sort of be on the watchtower here in Texas with respect to this is based on my time in office in the legislature, also serving on the House Energy Resources Committee, which is the Oil and Gas Committee, but also spending some time down there lobbying and also being a practitioner in the field, because my area of litigation has been the environmental litigation where pollution claims in oil fields are typically made. And so you run into the same sorts of perception issues in terms of what plaintiffs allege, what plaintiffs' lawyers want to argue, and what juries are inclined to want to believe. And so I would say that what needs to happen whenever you're confronted with those sorts of resistance factors on the perception side is that knowledge has to really not only double down, but triple, quadruple down. And I'll give you 3 quick examples of what I'm talking about, or illustrations at least. When I was in the legislature, and I don't believe it's changed, it's probably only gotten worse since then. This is in the early 2000s. We have 150 state representatives, we have 31 senators, so we have 181 elected officials in the legislature, and I could count on one hand the number of elected legislators who were conversant on oil and gas issues. That's not to say that there weren't other legislators who were friendly or who were supportive or generally favorably inclined towards the oil and gas industry, but it is to say that those people were not conversant, and as a result, whenever challenged, they didn't know what to say after they said they were basically supportive of the oil and gas industry. Now, how that manifests itself in sort of the second and third chapters of that story, oftentimes, is that that legislator who started off being your friend is quickly neutralized, where he doesn't want to say anything anymore because of his inability to articulate answers that are reasonable and supported by knowledge to the constituency that is challenging him. And even worse, they go beyond being neutralized to perhaps being unfavorably inclined towards the industry, at least publicly. You'll get a lot of those sort of whispers offside stage where they say, hey, I'm still with you, I just can't say anything about it, or that sort of thing. But that basically, that is a function of, a result of legislators not having sufficient knowledge to be able to respond to the challenge. So that's one real problem that existed then, continues to exist today, and we're talking about Texas with its heritage of oil and gas. That's a little surprising. It was surprising to me when I got to Austin that so few people were really conversant in this subject. Secondly, what I found is that the oil and gas lobby, and this is generally the lobby, trade organizations, and again, maybe some of the officials in the executive branch of the government, had an attitude of, well, we're Texas, and so oil and gas will always prevail even when we have these challenges. Yes, people are out there raising questions, issuing, sort of unsubstantiated statements about why oil and gas is a harmful thing, but after all, Texas is oil and gas country. It's our heritage. It's how we've become a great state. So we will always prevail. As a result, we don't need to worry about it. Well, to me, that's the attitude of the guy who's walking through the forest and thinking that just because it's deer season, it's not a problem that he's got a big target on his back, because no one will ever accidentally shoot him. And so we need to be aware of the fact that this sort of hearkening to the past attitude can very easily be overwhelmed before you realize it, and you're not sufficiently prepared. And once again, perception overcomes knowledge. The third thing that I felt like was, in my own personal experience, was a good illustration of this problem was the Keystone Pipeline. ended up participating in that debate in the context of being connected with, of all things, the pipeliner trade union that is involved with building the pipeline. This local 798 that's based in Tulsa was the major trade union that was responsible for building the pipeline, and most of this section that has gone from Cushing to the Texas coast. And as a result of serving in that role, I was appearing at the U.S. State Department public forums that were sponsored along the pipeline route a couple of years ago, and I witnessed something that I thought I would never see, but it underscored to me just how real this issue is and how we need to be prepared to do our part in not letting it get ahead of us like it did in Nebraska. But basically, I saw the alliance of environmental leftists and what otherwise were conservative Republican salt-of-the-earth Nebraska ranchers, arm in arm, teaming up to fight the pipeline. That was a very strange sight. It was about as strange as having, a trade union group dressed alike in their trade union shirts, arm in arm with management from TransCanada. That's not a common picture either. But it reminded me that the environmental left and let's just say opponents of the oil and gas industry generally are very effective and are 24/7 out there designing and developing their strategies for how to co-opt and bring into their fold certain interest groups out there that might not otherwise have ever thought of themselves as being potential allies, but bringing them into their group so that they can fight tooth and nail the oil and gas industry. In Texas, that manifested itself in the context of the environmental left teaming up with Tea Party representatives and constituents out in East Texas, people who decided that they were much more in favor of private property rights than they were hearing about oil and gas or about pipelines or about how that works economically and in everybody's everyday life. So those are just a few illustrations of the realities that exist right now, that if we don't expand our knowledge bench, if we don't make it deeper, if we don't educate, starting with our elected officials and making sure that they are equipped to articulate and defend positions with facts, that we could very quickly find ourselves on the short end of a lot of sticks.
Okay, thank you, Bill. There were we had some questions that were sent in, and I'm going to try a few of these on you. One is, this question is talking about that the Weather Channel had recently teamed up with some other organizations and issued a not so positive report about Texas, oil and gas industry in Texas, air quality and drilling regulations. The focus was on the Eagle Ford shale. But I think that one of the points of this report was that the Texas Railroad Commission and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality are underfunded and therefore can't really and are not doing the job they need to be doing. And so this report was very negative, actually, on oil and gas regulation in Texas. What would be your response to that, David?
Well, I think it's very important to realize exactly who was involved in that report and what those groups were. Those were some of the kind of groups that Bill was referring to that are strictly anti-oil and gas. They're out to make the case using, or perhaps I should say misusing, whatever facts and statistics they can find to make their case. Fact of the matter is that both the TCEQ and the Railroad Commission are two of the largest organizations of their kind in the entire nation as far as regulating the industries that they're regulating. Railroad Commission over the last couple of legislative sessions have made tremendous strides in getting funding restored. We went to a self-funding mechanism for the oil and gas division 2 sessions ago that has been successful so far in providing additional funds. We've added a number of new inspectors. It's always a struggle to hire competent people in this time frame where the industry is expanding also so rapidly in the state of Texas and offering extremely high salary levels. So yes, we're always out looking for good folks that will work at the salaries that we can pay at the state. But we've made good strides in the last 4 years in this direction and are continuing to go in this direction. Last session, we were approved for about $26 million total expenditure authority to upgrade our IT system, which needed to be done. And I can't directly speak to the TCEQ as far as their budget status. I really have no direct knowledge of that. But, you know, could we always use a few more good folks? Yes. And, you know, I guess my executive director would probably not be too happy if he heard me say we couldn't use any more money, so I won't say that. But we've been given the resources to do the job. We need to keep continuing to do it. Hopefully we can continue to find good staffers and increase our outreach in that area.
Very good. Another question pertains to, well, I guess you'd call it the urban nature of a lot of the development, oil and gas development in Texas. I mean, the Barnett Shale certainly in the Dallas-Fort Worth area is quite urban. The Eagle Ford, not so much so, but still, I'm not sure, you know, the definition of urban these days seems to be not all that specific. People just even out in what we used to call the country or rural now find themselves in the midst of very rapid oil and gas development. And that poses challenges. Jeff or Bill, what are your thoughts on the regulatory implications of the kind of the urban environment that so often find ourselves in?
Well, I mean, a couple of things I would say. One recent experience was this past session in 2013. I was involved with some folks who were wanting a bill to be considered in the Texas legislature that addressed some of the concerns that are presented by urban drilling, but presented in a way that certainly caused controversy and debate and really made it sort of a non-starter. One of the tensions that was contained in this bill was the regulatory authority struggle between the state in the body of the Railroad Commission and local government. And, you know, a recurring theme in Austin, whenever it's handy for folks, is always the local control thing. You know, they want local control until they don't want it, and then they give it back to you. But a lot of times, you know, it's sort of a reflex. Well, we want local control. We don't want Austin to tell us how to do X, Y, Z. And so it manifests itself now in the context of oil and gas development, in the urban setting especially, because a lot of municipalities, a lot of counties, certainly in the Barnett Shale, Ed knows that there are a lot of, you know, sizable towns and cities that are impacted, and they want to call the shots. They want to be able to say, who's going to drill, where are you going to drill, what's the setback going to be, are we going to allow fracking, and all the other questions that we see playing out across the country, but also here between local governments and Austin. That issue is going to have to be addressed and resolved. Historically, the way Texas has dealt with the development of oil and gas has been to basically handle it on a statewide basis with a state regulatory agency called the Railroad Commission. They didn't want to have a bunch of checkerboard, you know, operations across the state where you could do something here but you can't do it there. So local control definitely lost out early on to the notion that this is a much more efficiently handled job at the state level. But it's returning now as a result of the advent of urban drilling, and that fight's going to have to be addressed and resolved, and I don't know if it's going to end up being resolved in the courts, or if the legislature can be far-sighted enough to step up to the plate and say, we think it ought to be X, and we're going to make it that way so we can once and for all set the rules for companies like Pioneer so that they know how to plan and operate in the future. That's just one aspect of just this one little bill, but it brings to light just how significant these issues are, and to the extent that we do this and act like, well, it's worked okay till now, let's just keep, hoping that maybe it'll work out tomorrow without having to have a big fight about it. That's just not being realistic, number one, but it's also ceding the vacuum that I was talking about earlier to the perception police. They're going to be out there beating their drums 24/7. And to the extent that those of us who don't agree with them have an opinion, we better be out there on the offensive doing something about it.
I'd probably add to that the oil and gas industry would certainly not like to be treated more poorly than any of the other industries who are competing for some of these issues. For instance, on the issues of water, that's obviously the oil and gas industry gets a lot of attention on the amount of water that's used in fracking. What people don't appreciate is how small that number is in relation to what the farmers use and the municipalities and other industries. We're happy to be part of a collective solution to that, but we don't want to be penalized because we do a poor job as an industry of educating the typical citizen as to the really small nature from a percentage standpoint of what the oil and gas industry uses, for instance, in water. So again, we're all for smart, fair regulations and policies, and I think as an industry we do a poor job of countering the easy arguments that are made by people who are not so excited about the oil and gas industry.
Switch topics a little bit here. The XL pipeline is, of course, big in the news about getting the Canadian crude down to Texas, and it would be an important economic driver for the state. But LNG exports is another issue that's in front of us, and that's being driven by the Department of Energy. They give the license to export, and so it's not a decision that can be made in Texas. It's a decision made in Washington. And I believe Freeport LNG is one of the companies that has an export license, and they're under construction. But just how important do you think it would be for the continued development of the Texas oil and gas industry for LNG exports to be something that are not only granted but encouraged?
Commissioner Porter? Yes. I will never go in front of Commissioner Porter.
No, I think it's extremely important that we continue to develop markets right now, as most of you know, even though gas has come back fairly substantively the last few months. We're still way underpriced historically versus crude oil, and to continue the areas of the state right now that are most active, of course, are the shales and the oil-rich shales, particularly the Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford, and to a lesser extent up in the Panhandle, some of those fields, Barnett Shale, the East Texas areas have decreased substantially in the amount of activity. So that would clearly help the industry continue in Texas. And also, talking about exports, another thing I think we need to really look at is on the federal level is in removing the ban from the export of crude oil too.
Yeah, my father is a bit of a hawk when it comes to defense matters, and he's been following the Ukraine situation and has been critical of the current administration's response to that. And I've replied to him, what exactly do you want us to do? And I don't think most Americans would support the idea of us dropping troops into Ukraine. I know I probably would be against that, but I would offer a different response that might put a little more pressure on the Russians and Mr. Putin. Would be, how about if tomorrow the current administration says we're going to fast track LNG export permitting. We're going to lift the ban on crude oil export, and we're going to focus this fast track effort on our friends in Europe and Ukraine. I think that might get a little different response from Mr. Putin than what we otherwise have to do right now.
That's right. Be a big change in the whole geopolitical structure.
Yeah, and just 2 quick points, because I think this would be interesting to folks in terms of how revolutionary the shale gas development has been in this country and in the state. In 2003, when I was on the House Energy Resources Committee, we took days and days of testimony about permitting LNG facilities on the Texas coast to receive LNG imports. In other words, we were looking for ways to bring gas in because we didn't have enough. And so that was the whole nature of the discussion. And here we are in 2014 with the world, having done a 180 for us, and we're talking about permitting LNG exporting facilities. The other anecdote that came to mind was some of you might be familiar with the ConocoPhillips LNG facility in Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula. It's been there for 50 or 60 years. I got to tour that facility several years ago, and the central fun fact that the tour guide shared with us that made quite an impression on me was to ask all of us in our group, about who the customer has been for that facility all those years. Only had one customer, has shipped all of our LNG to this one customer the whole 40, 50 years we've been in operation. Can anybody guess who it is? Well, of course, all of us were like, Alaska, your own citizens, the west coast of the United States, California, someplace that sort of would make sense, if you're kind of just looking at things from a logical standpoint. And the answer was, no, the city of Tokyo. And the reason the city of Tokyo was its one and only customer is because they tried to find customers on the west coast of the United States, but they couldn't get anybody to accept what they were selling to the point of being willing to build an LNG receiving facility on the west coast. So all those folks who, for however many years, have been paying the energy prices they've been paying and complaining about whatever they've been complaining about, basically had put themselves in that position by simply saying, well, we don't want to destroy the beauty of our coastline by building a facility, so no, we don't want your natural gas. And Alaska, ConocoPhillips had to send it to another country for all those decades.
Good point. Just one more question. When we talk about unconventional oil and gas development, the word of the day is fracking. I was waiting for one of my car to be repaired, and the guy, service writer, says, "Well, what business are you in?" And I said, "Well, natural gas." That's my short answer. And he said, "Oh, are you a fracker?" And so it's become a common word. It's not even a word in the dictionary, and yet I know it's written into a lot of city ordinances. The question is about regulating fracking, and again, a lot of the questions I get are about that it's a new technique, it's experimental, highly dangerous. I mean, this is what people are being fed in the media, and it's having an impact. And we know that at the federal level, there's been an ongoing study about fracking or hydraulic fracturing now for some years, with the potential that the EPA would get involved in actually regulating hydraulic fracturing. So what are your thoughts on maybe both the public perception of hydraulic fracturing and the possibility that the EPA might insert themselves in the regulation of that technique?
I think it's important to realize, as you alluded to in your question, that hydraulic fracturing has been going on roughly for 60 years in the industry. I think the important thing to remember is if there is a danger at all to the environment from oil and gas activity, it's not from hydraulic fracturing, it's from such things as improper well casing integrity and bad cement jobs. That's one of the things that we at the commission have addressed within the last year when we did new rules on Rule 13 to address well casing integrity and cement jobs, that type of thing. If we have that done right in a well, then we're not going to have pollution problems, whether it's a conventional or non-conventional well. And I think that's the case that we need to make to the public, that this is not a problem. This is something that's been ongoing, and if it's handled correctly, like every other oil and gas well, that we're in good shape environmentally.
Yeah, and I would probably add to my earlier comments, and something that what David said is that fracking is not the problem, and our industry has done a really poor job of getting that fact out there. I have close friends who kind of look away when they mention fracking to me because they think it's an evil thing, until I explain to them that it's been done for 60 years and there's been no recorded cases of a frack job impacting the water supply, even though there's been tens of thousands of wells drilled throughout the United States. We do a poor job of communicating that as an industry, and then would I expect that the EPA could get involved with regulation of fracking? Certainly this is not the most promotive administration that we've seen towards the federal level to our industry, and so it would never surprise me that could happen. But I was happy to see that the administration's newest Department of Energy chair admitted under oath during his confirmation hearing that there'd never been a fracking case yet where the water supply was impacted.
Yes, well, this, in 2014, this apparently is the new F word that it's a much more dramatic reaction than the other F word, I think. But well, here's what I would say. This is Exhibit A for the perception versus knowledge thing that I was proposing in my initial remarks, and Commissioner Porter is so absolutely right about focusing on what really are the sources of the problems that cause people to think that fracking is the problem. I was involved. I mean, this might sound a little counterintuitive or contrary or oxymoronic or something, but when I was at Gardner and Wynn, we generally defended industry in these pollution cases, and we generally defended the big companies, ARCO, Chevron, Conoco. But on occasion, the firm said, we also want my little boutique practice to get involved on the plaintiff side. So there were a couple of 3 occasions where we represented people on the other side of the fence because what we were trying to market or promote was our expertise in the area, not necessarily that we only see the world one way, but that we know the subject matter. And so that led to what I'm not even sure Ed knows about this history for me, but I was involved in this World War III litigation against Mitchell Energy in the Barnett Shale back in the late 90s, when Gardner represented about 60 or 70 families in Wise County. So I always hasten to caution people in industry from making absolute statements and saying something never happened, something could never happen, and so that's the end of the conversation. Number one, that sort of undermines your credibility with whoever you're talking to and trying to persuade, because when you speak in absolutes, they figure you're just towing the party line and you're not really speaking in a way that's trying to be constructive. But the other thing that I mentioned is the reason I'm concerned about making those absolute statements is that in the Barnett Shale and in Wise County, Ed and David and Jeff are right that fracking has been going on for 60 years. But what was different about what Mitchell Energy started doing in the Barnett Shale was what has become known as super fracking. It was a much bigger deal on a much larger scale. What we found as a result of our investigation, and again, I mean, it was litigation. We were advocates for our side, so you have to kind of factor all that into it. But what we found as a result of our investigation was not that fracking was the culprit, but fracking in certain unprotected environments was the problem. So, like David was saying, there were wells that dated back to the 1950s that were short cased. They hadn't been cased with 3 strings of pipe like is typically done. They were only 2 strings of pipe, and the surface casing was short, and it didn't go all the way through the base of the freshwater aquifer. Now, why did that happen? Why did Mitchell do that back in the 1950s? Coming out of World War II, steel was short supply. And so they didn't have enough pipe readily available, but they wanted to go drill, and so they just drilled with what they had. And so what you ended up with was short-cased wells that had a lot of failures and lots of holes and lots of problems that permitted communication. So what I would caution all of us to sort of stay focused on is, instead of just saying it never happens, be on the offensive and say, you know what? Fracking's not the problem, and the reason that we're going to make sure it's never a problem is that we're going to make sure that our industry, when they go into an environment, go into a situation to start drilling these wells and fracking, that we've already inspected the area and made sure that we're not going to be conducting these operations in a way or in a place that has the possibility of allowing problems to occur. And that's what Dave was talking about with the new Railroad Commission rules, talking about wellbore integrity and cement. Those are the culprits. Those are the problems. But we've got to make sure about that. And the other thing I would just add, Ed, this is something Pennsylvania did by statute. I know that industry hates adding another item to the list of expenses when they go in to drill a well. The single best thing that a company can do whenever they go into a new area and start fracking, for sure, but just maybe operations generally, is to get baseline data for the water in the area so that you know exactly the quality of the water before you get started, and you're not sort of, you know, your back's not up against the wall 5 years later when they claim that whatever's wrong with the water is because of you.
Very good, thank you. I believe that's all the time we have.